Okay, we can get started. The Chief of Police is here. Good evening, folks. On behalf of Mayor Craig Thurman and the Broken Arrow City Council, it is my honor to welcome everyone here this evening. All I can say is wow. I want to thank everybody. What an awesome turnout. I want to do a few introductions before we get started, and I turn it over to our consultant. We still have some folks coming in, so let's try to make sure we make room for them. First off, once again, my name is Michael Spurgeon, and I am blessed to serve as Broken Arrow City Manager. And I'd like to introduce the Broken Arrow City Council to you right now. I'll introduce them and ask them to stand up. First off, we have our Mayor Craig Thurman. We have our Vice Mayor Scott Udi. We have Council Member Johnny Parks. We have Council Member Deborah Wimpy. You got a fan club, Deborah. And I am pleased to introduce our newest council member, Christy Gillespie. Now, Deborah, you can't be happy that she got bigger applause than you did. Okay. Okay, it's because you're new. Okay. I also have a number of folks that are very important to our community that I'd like to introduce. First and foremost, the two most important people for me are the two assistant city managers for the city. First off, we have Russell Gale, who's the assistant city manager for administration, and I also have assistant city manager Kenny Schwab, who's the assistant city manager of operations. I also look to my right. Let's give him a round of applause. These are the people that serve you every day. Over to your left are a lot of the city department directors, our street and stormwater director, our director of engineering and construction, Alex Mills. We also have Rocky Hinkle. I might miss someone. I see Krista Hemme, our communication director, our outstanding chief of police, Brandon Berryhill. Let's give a round of applause for our police department. You know, a lot of the things we are able to do in our city are based on the fact that we live in the safest city in the state of Oklahoma and one of the safest cities in America. If we did not have a safe community, we would not be able to do many of the great things that we're able to do. So I always want to give a shout out to our public safety when we can. We also have a number of members of our engineering construction team, our community development team. Acting community development director Larry Curtis is here along with his team, and I want to also Farhad Daroga, special projects manager. They have been responsible for herding this process to this point. I also see our city clerk Curtis Green, and there's many others. So if I miss anybody from the staff, I'm certainly sorry. Real quick, this process in terms of looking at the revitalization of Elm and New Orleans for the city started last year when the city council committed about $75,000 to $100,000 to hire a consultant to analyze the current conditions at the intersection. And they did that because they wanted to get some expert help in determining what improvements needed to be made by the public sector and what improvements would need to be made by the private sector in that partnership, which Broken Arrow has many of right now, to be able to revitalize this area, because it's very clear, especially from the last 2 to 3 years, revitalization at this area as well as growth in South Broken Arrow is important not only to people that live in South Broken Arrow like myself, but it's also important to the council, but to the entire community, because everyone wants to have access to businesses and industry that are convenient to them. And so the council felt it was an appropriate expenditure to hire a consultant, and that's where we started. You don't have a plan, you can get anywhere you want, but if you don't have a plan, you know, it maybe take you longer to get there. And so this is a process of first identifying what can be done, and then identifying the resources necessary and the partnerships necessary to make sure it gets done over time. So what we're going to do tonight is I'm going to turn this over to Jason Clonch from Catalyst, who is the consultant that was hired, and he's going to introduce his partner in this process. He's going to present the plan to the community, and then we're going to ask all of you to go out and to mingle among your friends and family and to go out and to make comments about what you see. This will be the next to last public comment before the document is actually presented to the City Council on August 6th. Because the process, with the governing body, I have to take my direction from the elected officials. And so they will finalize the plan with the public's comments, and then they will come back to the community on August 6th, and the council will take it under advisement, and they will ultimately adopt the plan. And I could see the City Council, because it's going to be my recommendation, that they create an advisory committee like we did with the downtown redevelopment to help the City Council and administration come up with recommendations on how we can implement what is in the plan. Having an advisory committee made up of both the public sector and the private sector, the citizens that live down here, the people that have a vested interest, is the only way that it's going to work, is when you combine the public sector and the private sector. Perfect example, you look at the Rose District. The Rose District is an investment that the city made over about 10 years, and that investment has been turned over 2 or 3 times by the private investment. And that's what I think we're looking for here, is for not only for the public not to be the only partner, but for also the private sector to let us know what they can do, and then together we can figure out how to fund these improvements and to entice businesses to stay and new businesses to come and those businesses to grow, and then continue to see our entire city grow just like other areas have. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Jason, and he's going to give the presentation and then let you know what the process is going to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Manager. First and foremost, it's an honor and pleasure to be back here. Fortunately, the rain cooperated finally for us to get back and present the plan. AJ was with ADG based out of Oklahoma City. He and I are going to present kind of the draft findings and some of the recommendations. But I want to be clear that both he and I are kind of a small part of that process. Both of our respective firms, played a large part of that. Last time we were here, there was a whole design team working with the public in terms of coming up with some of the findings. A quick show of hands, how many of you were at the last workshop that we had here? I know many of you I recognize, so just so you know, tonight is the second part of that process. We've provided some cards in most of the seats here, and we have extras. And so really the purpose of tonight, we're going to present some of the recommendations and findings. Majority of that we heard from you or best practices. And then in terms of next steps, we want to make sure there should be pens in the seat pockets. If not, there's some outside. I want to make sure that it's clear just in terms of tonight's format. We want to make sure that we hear comments, both positive and negative. If you think that there's some big ideas that we've left off, tonight is the night that we want to capture that so we can essentially absorb that, integrate your ideas again one more time back into the plan before we propose the final to council late summer. So anyway, I just want to kind of set the ground rules. I'm going to talk for a few minutes in terms of our findings, and then we're going to get into some of the recommendations and some of the things that we think can help advance this process. And again, thank you very much for being here. Next slide. Pens if anybody needs them. And we'll have plenty of time, and then we're going to stay, just so you know, after the presentation. We're going to stay around as long as I think the church will let us, and we still have cookies and coffee and water. We're happy to discuss individually or as groups around some of the stations that we've set up. So again, feel free to comment that away as well. We began this journey, and I really looked at it as the art of the possible. We started this process with a complete blank slate, unbiased, and really started this from a perspective of just understanding sort of what's on the ground. We set forth some of the goals. We wanted to make sure that the recommendations and the plan forward is sustainable. We also want to make sure that it's enduring, and so that's why we spent so much time engaging with the public, engaging with some of the property owners in the neighborhood, is we wanted to make sure that this reflected your vision, not ours. And then I think the key, and Mr. Spurgeon mentioned this earlier, the whole goal of this process is implementation. And so a lot of things you'll see tonight are going to be geared towards that implementation. So next slide. So we look at, in terms of market, we look at a couple different cycles. There's two cycles. One, there's a virtuous cycle. Essentially, you've got new development that attracts sales and investment, which can be reinvested in the center. And then you have a vicious cycle, and sometimes these things build upon themselves. You've got vacancy, maybe functional obsolescence. Some of the building depths are big. Maybe the parking lots are in deterioration. And so the purpose of this process is to sort of set up the stage again and find opportunities to create those virtuous cycles. You do that through aligning the land use. Today, the market's changed. Some of the things have shifted. There's been, zoning cases in terms of reorging some of the boxes, and so we want to make sure that the land use matches the vision. We also want to find those initiatives that can continue to attract private investment. Some of that is public investment, and we'll talk about some streetscape and some other improvements. But the key is what can we do in terms of intervention to attract greater private investment at the intersection. We also want to attract greater merchandising. Merchandising means more tenants. That can also mean housing. That can also mean a mix of uses. But we want this process to essentially increase the merchandising quality and align with those vision and values that we heard through this process. And ultimately, to create vibrancy and to create experience and to continue to build community and make this really a special intersection that it once was and it can be. And really, I look at this opportunity as taking something that's good and making it great again. I think the fundamentals are certainly there. So some of the things that essentially we uncovered, I'm going to walk you through some of the things that are contributing to some of the issues and challenges that we found. There's a lot of retail leakage as the expressways and new thoroughfares and new retail nodes have gotten built. A lot of the sales tax dollars that used to get spent here at this intersection, what we call nodes, we did look at, and it essentially is leaking, what we call leaking, but those dollars are being spent now in other places of the community. Maybe it's newer formats, kind of newer concepts. There's also a substantial amount of vacancy. That certainly can contribute to the experience that could be mitigated through, again, new tenants and new formats. Today there's been numerous studies that people like and enjoy, and that those places that are walkable are more productive. And so I think, essentially, if you look at the shopping center today with the parking lot and the fields and the way the road is designed, the primacy is towards the cars. And so we want to look at opportunities. Can we make this more walkable? Can we break up some of the expansive parking lots and create opportunities to integrate some green spaces? So we'll talk about those things. And then essentially, we look at land uses, and when you're creating new places, we like to look at uses as transition opportunities and not buffers. And if you look at the way the shopping center is oriented towards the neighborhood, it's disconnected. And so we want to explore as an opportunity to sort of increase the connectivity, both in the neighborhoods, and then also look at opportunities to create the network so that this intersection is more accessible throughout the region. So, go back one more if you can. Some things that have just naturally occurred, and this occurs over time, is changing demographics. So essentially, this area was full of young, families and starter homes. That's changed. There's a lot of aging in place, and now newer families are moving in. So you have to align the merchandising to cater to those changing demographics. With the vacancy, with the merchandising quality, you start to lose synergy and gravity. Again, that affects retail sales. And then ultimately, all of this contributes to economic loss. And when we think about economic loss, we need to revive this intersection in order to stimulate the private investment and more sales tax to get spent so that essentially you can reinvest in the center. And so that's sort of the do loop that we're trying to get out of. We did find out through this process, we interviewed, again, the majority of the ownership. There's some legacy ownership. Some of those property owners are hard to change. They're cash flowing. And so there's a business model set up, and so it's very difficult to disrupt, and we don't want to disrupt those business models, but we want to find opportunities to sort of enhance those opportunities. And so working with the current ownership will really require an incremental approach that will happen over time. And again, I think some of the property owners will ultimately need to align their business plan with some of the recommendations, but that doesn't happen overnight. You've got tenants in place and ownership changes. And then I would say that probably, if you ask me, the greatest issue facing this intersection today was just a lack of unified vision. All the owners were sort of going in a different direction. We asked, what do you see in different places, or what do you think is the best idea? And we would get radically different ideas from different people. An investment requires predictability, probability, and consistency. And when you don't have adjacency predictability, when there's not consistency in ideas, it makes it harder to stimulate that investment. So I'm going to introduce AJ, and he's going to talk a little bit about existing conditions in terms of just some of the fundamental structural things also that we noticed during this process.
Yeah, so AJ Kirkpatrick, I'm with ADG in Oklahoma City. Very proud of my Broken Arrow roots. I think I told the group last time, my grandmother has lived in Vandiver Acres since the mid-1960s. Have family dating back to the 1920s, though. So if you know any Lemons or Ellers or Kirkpatricks, I would love to talk to you. You might know my family, so find me afterwards. I grew up spending a lot of summers here. Saw some great summer blockbusters at the old movie theater. So have lots of memories of this intersection. So I appreciate the opportunity to get to work in Broken Arrow. Jason comes from more of a retail private sector background. My background is more public and planning, so my side of this is about the planning design, making sure that we have some of the right policy framework in place. Go ahead to the next slide. So we had a full team of design professionals at the last meeting. They were here to get some of your feedback. These are some of the takeaways from it. This is our initial study boundary that we limited our analysis to. Go ahead to the next one. This is your existing zoning. It's got a lot of your older zoning categories that your new zoning code has replaced in some cases. You've seen lots of PUDs that were done on specific properties. Generally, the takeaway, though, is that a lot of these are considered more of your single-use zoning categories, and a lot of communities are starting to look for ways to bring in more mixed-use zoning. So you don't have any of your mixed-use zoning categories in here, and that's something you might want to be looking at moving forward, of ways that we can start to get more commercial and residential maybe mixing with each other and making this more of a walkable environment. Go to the next one. Overall, you're serviced well in terms of your drainage and your topography. You've got two different basins here. You've got a west basin that drains primarily to some structures that you've built in the neighborhoods to the northwest. And then the east basin is more of a slow sheet flow that goes straight east across the entire east basin there. Go to the next one. In terms of utility infrastructure, you've got lots of utility infrastructure. That actually is something that we identified as something you might want to be looking at in terms of dressing up the intersection. There are lots and lots of overhead wires in this area, and I think sometimes we start to become blind to those until we come in and look at it again. If this area were to redevelop significantly, certain properties may have to have some of that reworked. There's been quite a bit of significant extensions from the public right-of-ways. So there might be some expectation there might need to be some city involvement in helping that redevelopment catalyze through some of those public infrastructure improvements. Go to the next one. Parking, I would say the dominant feature right now of this intersection is the parking. There are gigantic fields of parking right now, and that's an opportunity. That is a place where we can really start to look for places to redevelop. In all the aerials that we used throughout this project, I never saw more than 25% of all the parking being used. This is from a different time when people all felt like they needed to build for the day before Christmas, and they didn't care what happened, with the parking for the rest of the day. But that, again, that's an opportunity here. One other thing I'll point out while we're looking at this too, that we think is unique to this compared to other commercial intersections of its time, is that you actually still have quite a bit of vacant land around this, and that's a real opportunity here. That's a potential to bring in immediately some new households with more disposable income, folks that might be looking for to be part of something that's being reborn through this project. Go to the next one. I'll turn it over to Jason to talk about public engagement.
So we wanted to make sure that this plan reflected the community's wants and needs and desires. And so we had a number of public workshops. We hosted one a few months ago at City Hall. We had the format here. We wanted to make sure that we received a substantial amount of public engagement. And so I want to give you a little bit of feedback because I want you to make sure that you recognize some of the ideas and concepts that we heard that get iterated back into the plan. Next slide. So some of the things that we heard and we respected and made sure that we reflected is that you want to create opportunities for cultural activities, at Elm and 101 or Elm and New Orleans. I think that was important. Place that you can hold events and festivals and sort of bring back the community to the intersection. In terms of orientation or merchandising, certainly, having opportunities that are family oriented would be ideal. An increased sense of security. Broken Arrow is an extremely safe place, in terms of crime, but the lighting, some of the lighting is out through the redevelopment, and just essentially those large parking lots that aren't well maintained. And maybe it gives you a sense, if you're not from here or you don't live in the area, maybe a sense of security issue. We heard a lot about connectivity, and when you think about connectivity, a lot of times you think about physical connectivity that I described earlier, but also opportunities for social connectivity. And so we'll talk a little bit about opportunities to integrate both physical and social connectivity, which I think is important. We heard a lot about educational opportunities, and I think even in today's new retail environment, retailers are taking note of that. People want experience. People want to be educated. They want to understand where their stuff comes from and how it's made. And so we've reflected that back in terms of the merchandising. There may also be a higher ed opportunity in terms of thinking about mixed use and integration, maybe some small office or medical opportunities for educational opportunities there as well. This district needs to be different than any other district in Tulsa, and so that makes it challenging, but this needs its own sense of place. And so the merchandising strategy, the types of tenants that are pursued, the way it feels, the placemaking, any of the parks and open space, it needs to be uniquely different than any other place. Very similar to the Rose District. You go to the Rose District and it feels different than any other place in the region. And so part of that, it will be our goal, is implementing those opportunities. You'll see some images that sort of exemplify that. We haven't engaged a full branding effort, but it'll give you a sense that this place is certainly different, and start to create its own brand. Again, a sense of place, vibrancy. Large, expansive parking lot and vacancy don't give you the vibrancy that I think people want in terms of experience. And then the concepts need to be experiential, and so thinking about maybe family entertainment, maybe potentially bringing entertainment back. Cultural entertainment doesn't need to be at the theater. I think that's well served probably to the south, but maybe something formatted that makes sense. I think in key of one of the opportunities with the large parking fields is integrating open space and creating some more green space and little parklets. Those don't have to be big to be activated and to be used, but so we'll show some examples. And then again, just active places. So these are the things that essentially we heard through the public engagement that we wanted to make sure that we reflected into this process. Next slide. And so just in terms of some of the physical opportunities that I think can be addressed through policy, encouraging property owners to update the facades and bring those current. We see some redevelopment, but also a lot of revitalization. There's good bones and framework to a lot of these buildings. Obviously, in terms of merchandising quality, integration of a mix of uses. Your zoning doesn't accommodate that today, but I think as a community and as a retail format, we desire that. Certainly improve landscaping, so we'll talk a little bit about those opportunities. Increasing and improving the parking lots in appropriate places. Increasing walkability, and so that may be wider sidewalks and more landscaping and building edges that encourage that, and so there's a design that can be integrated. And then obviously improving lighting. I think that's a very simple fix that can be done, again, property by property. Next slide. So we heard some vision, we heard some ideas, we heard some structural improvement, but ultimately I think the question that we got asked a lot, is there capacity? Can you do this here? How does this get done? Is there a market for this based on the demographics? We know the demographics here are different than other places, and we have more retail demand, or the rental rates are higher in other places, and so we spend a lot of time looking at the market capacity here, and I'm going to give you some highlights tonight. Next slide. One of the things that we noticed, and I think this is some interesting findings, but the retail spending and the capacity in Broken Arrow is greater than the region at large. So there are more sales dollars spent in this region per capita than Tulsa and the MSA at large. I think that was very interesting. And essentially that was true at every expenditure. So that includes apparel, that includes food, that includes entertainment. And so for us, I think that's very encouraging. It's a very salient point in terms of promoting this to some of the retailers. Next slide. We also spent time looking at a number of districts. We did this in terms of the comp plan process, which translated into the work we did at Elm and 101. This map is hard to translate on this slide, but essentially we looked at cell phone records and figured out where people actually shop in comparison to where they live to identify what is the trade area for this intersection. And essentially we found that this intersection essentially can serve the greater region, and it does. So there's a capacity to bring that back and integrate uses. But essentially this intersection is strategic as probably any other intersection within the district. And we know that there's still gravity here. The key is we're not getting the sales outcome that we could, that we think we could, based on what the data is telling us. Next slide. And so essentially what we found out that the purchasing power within the district alone is about $4.9 billion. And there's over 3.6 million square feet of supportable retail demand that gets generated just within the primary trade area of Elm and New Orleans. So again, that's more than 10 times the amount of square footage of retail that's there today. The key is it's formatting and positioning and some of the common elements that we talked about. And then we started measuring leakage. Essentially, there's leakage for groceries. Even now, more that Reasors is left. There's capacity for general merchandise, building supplies, sporting goods, furniture stores, and I can go on and on and on the list. So we know that the purchasing power here, and we know that there's leakage, there's money being spent in the community that comes out of this area. The key is how do we recapture that through a merchandising effort, and part of that will be through the revitalization and redevelopment of the center itself. Next slide. So in order to do that, I think the key is we need to take the vision and calibrate the land use that matches the current vision that's starting to evolve through this process. And so next slide. I'm going to let AJ walk through a little bit of you saw the slide on the zoning. I'm going to let AJ walk through some of the land use designations that were recommended as part of the plan to calibrate the land use vision with some of the recommendations.
And we should point out, because I see a lot of people squinting and taking photos, all this material is going to be included in the final report. I believe that's going to be made available online, so you can dig into any particular issue or item that you're interested in the document. So inherent to any of this effort is that we're going to need to change some of the land uses that you currently have, maybe tweak what you already have, and try to make this again something that's a little more walkable and is more of a cohesive district. So this is some of the land uses that we are proposing to change things to. I'm going to walk you through each one of these categories, and it's going to have some associative images of what we would like to see in the best world develop in some of those areas. So,
and I want to interject in terms of developing this land use. Some of these concepts, it's a new vocabulary. So these are new sort of mixed-use vocabulary that we've recommended and introduced to accommodate the vision that we'll roll out in the later slides. So.
Yeah, and I think again one of the big takeaways here is this area has changed, and we're going to need to set a new vision for how it can come back to something that will be a benefit to the neighborhoods around it. And so this is the first step of how we start to do that. So go ahead to the next slide. So the first zoning or the land use category that we're proposing is this suburban mixed use. And again, I mentioned earlier trying to move from what was the old style of separating our land uses very heavily and to something that would start to allow people maybe to have residential and commercial in the same project. You think about the way that the Rose District was originally built by our previous generations. So in this zoning category, we would have up to 4 stories. I'm sorry, not in the zoning category, the land use category. We'd have up to 4 stories. And the goal is really to start to increase biking and walking, We would like to see some increased landscaping requirements in these areas. You guys have a lot of these parking lots that were built prior to landscaping requirements, and it really shows when you go out and look at them. I am saying a lot of funny things tonight. This is great. I love this crowd. And I wanted to say, I've never been to a meeting where people have cheered for their city councilors like I saw tonight. You guys are amazing. Encourage shared parking. There's the realization that we don't need every space at all times. So when you start to mix uses, you start to see some overlapping of usage. You don't necessarily need to be parked where you live and where you work at the same time. So take advantage of some of those shared resources. So moving on to the next one, commercial core. This is, go to the next slide. So commercial core, I think it's got some animation. If you go ahead and click on it'll bring the circles in better. So commercial core is, I would say, is the closest to what we already have. But it may have some new aspects to it. So one of the things we're talking about is starting to bring some open space in. That's something we've seen in some commercial district or some commercial developments, is starting to actually put in green space where there was parking before, and start to have playgrounds and places for people to recreate within commercial developments. So you might start to see some pocket parks. Generally, this particular category is going to be focused on your arterials. So you're still going to have pretty high auto usage, but it is going to start to shift that momentum a little bit more towards, again, that walkable environment, trying to increase activity overall. On the next one, we have the town center residential. And this is starting to realize, again, that point I made earlier, that you actually have quite a bit of vacant land around here. And so it's important that you're starting to set a vision for how that land should be reused. It may not be enough to just do another suburban neighborhood with that land. There are ways that you could take advantage of some of the shifts that we're seeing on the national trend in the housing markets of starting to do more walkable housing. And that starts to call for the need that you'll see later to start to actually create connections through some of these buildings. These are some very long retail buildings, especially on that southwest corner. So in some of our plans, we're going to start showing ways that we can start to break through some of those buildings with some interventions, start to allow for people to actually start, to make that connection to the neighborhoods a little more porous.
And I'll make a comment. The idea, we talked about, land uses as transitions instead of buffers. So the idea is to take the existing neighborhood and be sensitive to that. So these are all sort of context-sensitive ideas, but as you get closer and closer to sort of the streets, it allows different intensities that can kind of translate over time. And so these are ideas that essentially allow you to transition land use densities from the existing neighborhood very naturally to that commercial core, rather than having these hard edges where you've got the backs of shopping centers next to a traditional residential neighborhood. I think it's much more appropriate, and it'll encourage the walkability and livability. This also allows you to introduce housing choices that you may not have in the market, which can be very attractive in terms of development as well.
That's right, and those are all excellent points. We wanted to be very respectful to the neighborhoods that are already surrounding this, and we wanted to make sure that there was a slow transition up to this activity on the main arterials. Another thing that Jason touched on in the demographics is this is an area that is starting to age. And that starts to raise questions of where do those folks want to live when they leave their homes. And so this starts to open opportunities for more compact housing where people might be able to live closer to those retail corridors as well, and those services they need as they age. What we've shown, though, are mostly ownership opportunities. I want to really drive that home. We're showing a lot of townhome opportunities, but having more of the shared wall, so that you're not necessarily having just single-family detached in these northwest and southwest corners. So stepping up then again to Village Mix is the next one. So you can see that it's a lot of the same. You might start to see a little bit higher intensities in some of those. We would recommend that you would push those those with higher intensities closer to the arterials, further away from the existing residential neighborhoods. Nowhere are we saying any more than 4 stories in development. So again, this is going to be mostly townhouses and cottage homes. And then finally, I think we have a couple more actually. In terms of the residential categories, the last residential category would be infill suburban. So this is going to be more typical to what you've seen in the neighborhoods up to now. It may be pushing a little bit more in terms of doing smaller lots than what you're used to. But can you go ahead and push the animation? It's really only being used in that northeast corner behind the church, where we felt like that made the most sense to include that. So moving on to medical and office. This area has had a long history of having a lot of medical uses, of course, before the hospital shut down. But we still see some value to that, particularly again with an aging population. You're going to expect to start to see more people that want to open clinics and doctors' offices to be near their clients. In this category, we're only using it in the Northwest. You can see it ringed there. No more than 5 stories max on that. Really focused again on Elm, on that arterial, and making sure that you have high quality exteriors, any development that you might get out of that. And then last, this area, it may not be apparent when you first look at it, but it actually has a very strong institutional aspect to it. Of course, you have the freshman academy and whatever that becomes as the school district continues to grow. But you also have a very strong presence of churches as well, and realize that is going to continue to be part of the future of this. Through this, I think there are some opportunities to maybe start to get some of the churches as partners to start, as they are needing to grow, to start to upgrade some of their facades, maybe start to pull their buildings closer to the street, and also contribute to that more walkable environment that we're proposing.
And I'll say you recently had a zoning case for places of assembly where the old Hobby Lobby was, and I would say that that's a good representation of really creating a commercial edge and maintaining the commercial vitality and the experience and the activity, but still allowing some of the institutional uses that can integrate very nicely within the commercial district. So,
you want to go ahead and start us on strategies on the next slide?
So we've talked a lot about sort of setting the stage, so I want to walk you through some of the very simple, I think, recommendations that we have uncovered that I think would help sort of stimulate some of these activities and create the framework and the opportunity to attract that private investment. One would be kind of a very simple approach of just enhancing the streetscapes. As AJ mentioned and as you observed, we want to make this intersection look special. That's a very simple way to sort of set the stage. A lot of your intersections look fairly consistent and homogeneous because of the standards that were in place when a lot of the existing retail is developed. And I think some very few interventions in terms of adding additional planning and using some of the existing right-of-way and opportunities within that, to the medians, to increase the plantings and streetscape just at the intersection would be a game changer in terms of revitalizing and setting the stage and creating something and setting the stage that this is something special. Very similar to what occurred in the Rose districts along the plantings and the streetscapes that were improved there. I think the same process, different design, could essentially stimulate this area as well.
So some of the things I'll point out, our design team did some of the pictures that you'll see of the cross sections of the street. We'll get to it later, but because of the overhead wires, it makes having any trees of significant height on the sides of the street pretty difficult at the time being. That's one of the reasons we're going to recommend later that you need to start looking at ways that we can remove some of those. But if you can start to take back some of that median, right now it's really just painted space, that is a place where you could start to do maybe some trees in the center lane. And Broken Arrow has a great history of naming your streets after trees, and gosh, we thought, wouldn't it make a lot of sense if there were some elms at New Orleans and Elms? To piggyback on Jason's points, this is the lowest hanging fruit that we believe. We've seen it happen in community after community where they've started to see this downward cycle of disinvestment. This is these sort of streetscape improvements are something the public sector can do to tell the private sector this is not what it used to be. Something has fundamentally changed here, and we want to get you guys back to the table and reinvesting as we did. I'll mention here, we've got some signage examples. That's another thing that we can start to see is some shared branding opportunities. Go ahead to the next slide. This is Reno. If you guys have ever been to a Thunder game in Oklahoma City, this was before our Project 180 streetscapes. Hardly any landscaping outside of the trees on either side. But go ahead and flip that, and that's what Reno looks like today. And you can see how much that changes the character of that block, and it starts to give pedestrians some refuge as they're trying to cross streets. This is a very wide arterial, so even if you wanted to start having people walk, it's going to be a little bit daunting as a pedestrian to try to cross that. So you need to start giving them some places of refuge. Go ahead to the next one. Do you want to start with Tactile? Okay.
So one of the other opportunities is just, we heard a lot about activation and programming, and one of the easy opportunities, I think, would be what we call, I guess in the professional world, tactical urbanism, sort of a kitschy name, but essentially it's an opportunity to create temporary plazas, temporary parks. You can do that, maybe bring in some food trucks, roll out some fake grass and carpet, get some big chess games, and you can do this around events or create events and start to program, Friday night, roll it back up, put it on the trailer, take it back. And so a lot of communities, we're doing some work down in Bryan. They've got First Fridays that's completely packed now, and a lot of that are just quick vendors in kiosk and places, again, that can start to stimulate the market and provide uniqueness and vibrancy around festivals or events or evenings to start to generate a market and create more gravity at this. And these are opportunities to demonstrate essentially things that can ultimately become permanent, but demonstrate opportunities and sort of test the market before the district fully matures. So.
And I'll say these are some examples that we're seeing in other communities of this rollout grass, and again, the emphasis is on quick, cheap, easy. It's about helping people redefine the space, realize that there's more life here than you might see going by at 40 miles per hour. This is where churches become, as someone who's worked on some of these projects, this is where churches are a great partner. Because you're looking around at how do I get people to show up? Well, you've got people that already have built-in communication networks that can start to activate these spaces and start to take some ownership of some of these projects.
I mean, you can have basketball tournaments or pickleball, and you just think of kind of the ideas and start to create opportunities for programming and theming that could essentially be implemented very easily, very inexpensive, and really managed within the district itself. That's not something that really it could be done through partnerships, or maybe the businesses get together and sponsor these things, and that these things can build and take on life and gravity of their own. So, next slide.
Just some more examples that we've seen. Those chairs in the bottom left are the hallmark of tactical urbanism. They seem to show up in that, and picnic tables to show up as some of the easiest things that people can get their hands on.
So we talked a little bit about some of the improvements, but we wanted to spend some time in terms of opportunities to increase walkability. So really paying attention to the intersections and median, and providing signage and identity. And this is kind of the next phase of that work, where you're really starting to get into placemaking and identity and branding, and some interventions that can be done to start to really create the sense of place and build the community and create safer crossing and increase pedestrian activity. And so some of that could be done through sort of mid-block or ad hoc crosswalks to sort of connect kind of the north and south districts or east and west districts very naturally. And these would obviously occur maybe near those pocket parks and plazas, so that you can encourage different circulation safely in a controlled environment, but also use it to start to brand and enhance the district. Next slide. So one of the, I guess, the most complicated parts of this project is the overhead electric. These are large facilities. There's a lot of utilities in them. They're expensive to sort of bury. That'd be the greatest option, is sort of bury them underground. The problem with power underground is it makes it very difficult when you have issues to maintain. So that's not something that necessarily is preferred by the utility companies. So But it also provides a challenge because you can't really create some mature tree canopies, and there's so many power lines almost at every intersection. We recognize that this created some constraints. We looked at several options. Some of the areas, maybe you could bury those in certain key segments where they're really critical. Another opportunity that we looked at is maybe they don't go away, but maybe they could be relocated at certain key parts, and maybe you couldn't do that in the entire intersection, but maybe there's an opportunity through redevelopment to reroute those, maybe behind some of the commercial areas where you don't see them along the streetscape. I think it'll improve the aesthetics and maybe mitigate some of the economic issues with them, and then open up the palette to create some of the plantings. And so we provided some images of areas sort of before and after that also have stimulated sort of the visual appeal.
And this project in itself is going to have to be very piecemeal, and it really will be spurred by the redevelopment of specific properties. But it's important for the community to be aware of those opportunities when these start to go into redevelopment. That might be something that your typical developer may not want to touch. It may be too expensive. And again, that's a place where if it's important to the community, that's a priority in this study, that the city can start to come in and maybe do some partnering funds to make sure that particular priority gets addressed. Go ahead. Some just additional photos of the lines. I think another thing that's important is now that this has existed for 50 years, this may not be the most efficient way to run your lines. It may be helpful to, as a first step, to even just look to see if there's some ways to rerun some of these lines so you can at least get one side of the street, so you can start to get some trees planted or some additional landscaping. Go ahead.
And I think the other sort of most obvious in the feedback that we got is an opportunity through those large parking fields and the economies it created through mixed use, where if done appropriately, you create and sort of take advantage of that excess capacity, is using that space to create what we call open space or park or parklets or plazas. I think that would completely change the environment. It would completely change the usability. And so it would also create opportunities to sort of leverage maybe some restaurants with a plaza along some of the streetscapes, where you could again maybe enjoy a beverage and hang out and create different opportunities for more community and family. And then again, that could be done a number of different ways at a number of different spots. We've shown really plazas and parklets of different scale and sizes throughout sort of the plan. We'll get into some of the plan components just to show you examples that these don't have to be huge, large, grand plazas or parks. Really, very small, 50 feet by 50 foot or 100-foot strips can make significant difference within the districts. If you look at kind of the bottom, if you want to envision maybe some of the tactile urbanism that was demonstrated earlier, maybe those places start to mature into more permanent places. And again, that could be done through some public-private partnerships or just through policy encouraging these plazas to get developed as redevelopment and revitalization occurs.
And exactly what I was going to say is you think of that tactile urbanism as ways to start to test out with short-term money what you might want to do long-term, and maybe something that you do for fun eventually becomes a permanent place. That bottom photo on the bottom right, I want to make sure I point that out. That is from Midwest City, Oklahoma. I always try to strive to find examples from Oklahoma because we have so many people that won't work in Oklahoma, but that is working in Oklahoma. And it's amazing when you're in it how simple just putting that green space across from strip retail, what would otherwise be strip retail, you start to get a town square feeling to that. And so we're going to propose a couple of places in the intersection where you might be able to do something like that. Go to the next one.
And I think another option is just, and we talked a little bit about this through the land use and the vision, is just providing some alternate housing choices. Again, AJ mentioned opportunities to age in place, where you may not want to maintain a home and a yard, but you still want to live in the district. It's where your friends and your family are nearby. It's where a lot of your services and the retailers that you're comfortable with, and you develop relationships over time. And so the key is to create a mix of housing choices that can both cater to maybe new young families that are interested in moving into the district and being part of the new community, but also create kind of a vibrant mix of housing. But we didn't want to create a dominance of any one housing type, and we also wanted to create sort of that transition and also be sensitive to the existing neighborhood. And so that's why we introduced a lot of new vocabulary in terms of the land use, is to accommodate those things to occur over time. So I want to show you sort of all this gets coalesced into a new master plan. This is really an illustrative. These are examples. This isn't a template of how everything has to get done in the future. Most of the time, if you're going to work on a development or redevelopment, normally the site plan that gets completed is somewhere around SP or SP 101. So there's even a process that gets developed even on individual properties that take some time in the iterative processes. Maybe Texas Roadhouse wants to be here, but for whatever reason they don't come, so somebody else shows up. All those changes will change the site plan. So what we're showing you tonight is essentially examples of some of the principles and applications on different parcels. That doesn't mean that that's the way that'll get built, but we wanted to show you sort of people are visual, show illustrative, or illustrate how this could get done in terms of the master plan. So next slide. And I think the key is one of the things that we wanted to set up for this district and introduce in the plan, that this can be an incremental process. There's no way to eat the elephant at one time and change all these things at one time. There has to be an incremental approach. You can't just take down all the power lines. The city, forces you to integrate parks, and all the facade gets updated in 30 days. And so we wanted to show this plan and a process that gets done on an incremental basis. And I don't mean incremental in an insignificant way, but that it could be done in segments and pieces and parts, but ultimately the sum of the parts is greater than one individual part. And so this is an example of the southwest corner, again showing some of the transitional housing that gets built. Maybe there's some mixed use, some commercial that gets built along the roadways, and then we've introduced maybe towards the end of the third year the potential that maybe some of that tactical urbanism can sort of evolve into a small permanent plaza that you'll see in later plans that may start to become the framework of places that restaurants may locate down the road. Again, these are just examples. Next slide.
So I'm going to walk you through some of the visuals that our team created based on the feedback, again, that we heard from you and from stakeholders in our interviews. Again, building on what Jason's saying, we did these in a very watercolor style to reinforce that this is somewhat ethereal. This is about setting vision. It's not necessarily exactly how it's going to happen. Some of those phases may move around. You may see other things happen first, but just trying to break it down into digestible pieces. This is an image looking east along New Orleans, right at the intersection. So you can start to see that you have some increased streetscape enhancements there. You're starting to get some nicer sidewalks, some street trees. Go ahead to the next one. So this is pretty much that same angle, but looking down on it. So we've shown you what an enhanced intersection treatment might look like. Playing again on that elm name, that's an elm leaf. So you can start to see again that you've got some reinforced pedestrian crossings, reminding cars not to park there when they get to the stoplight, so they're giving people space. Go to the next one. We had some conversations about how to deal with bikes, and right now with the width that it is, we really don't feel like it would necessarily be a good idea to have especially novice bicyclists riding with that traffic. What we've seen in more suburban applications is maybe the use in that larger photo on the right of a shared pedestrian bike path that's off the road, that's outside of the roadbed. So we wanted to look for maybe a solution of how we could bring that in. This is in suburban Lawrence, Kansas. So go ahead to the next one. So you can see there in the bottom left, that's a much wider sidewalk than you would typically expect. And the reason we put it on the south side is because you've got a freshman academy on that south side, and you've got kids that probably we need to start getting back on bikes and walking to school as part of a larger conversation that we're having about obesity and some of the lifestyle practices of our children. So there you can start to see some of the landscape median there, and then that's on New Orleans looking west. So go ahead to the next one. So we know that this is New Orleans, but when we first did some of the drawings, we did it as 101 and Elm. We thought the two just seemed like they really looked good together. And so we talked about changing it, but we talked to some people that said, I actually like the way that looks. And so we played with that idea, and we had our design team come up with some ways that we could start to do some shared place markers that could start to be put in the medians or on the corners of that key intersection. You want to talk a little bit about the importance of shared branding on that?
Yeah, so, and again, we took another approach. So if you look at the plan, we created a logo that's E and N and O, so that, again, just trying to pick up on some branding. There'll be more of a formal approach that gets created, and that'll be something that really needs to be identified by the community. But again, these are just examples of landscaping and branding elements, and you notice sort of the new streetscape to reflect the elm. Ultimately, you want to reflect a new identity and new branding for the district, and so this is one of the ways that would sort of example to reflect that. Next slide.
So this one, you can find your way by the water tower. If you remember where the water tower is there on the southwest, this is taking you inside the neighborhood that we're trying to build back in that southwest corner with a lot of that vacant land. So you can start to see some of the sizing and density of the housing that we're talking about, just some minor increases to the surrounding neighborhoods. In some cases, it may actually be pretty similar to what's already in the existing neighborhoods, but starting to find ways to connect to all those buyers that are already there, start to give them some new paths into the commercial areas that would feel a little safer than driving them out to the arterial. Go to the next one. And then this is actually on the arterial. This would be on the south side of New Orleans. So starting to show you again, this is only 2 stories as we've shown it, but starting to see some of the maybe more townhouse style. It's more of a shared wall residential product. And again, you want to make sure that these are getting pushed up onto those arterials, starting to create more of a strong street edge and more of a pedestrian corridor on those sidewalks.
And I want to say that we're not recommending any specific design palette. These are just examples, and so ultimately you may create a different design palette or have design regulations that are different. But this also shows sort of the increased plantings along the streetscape, and then in the introduction of that green space, or maybe a pocket park, or just sort of expanded green space along a thoroughfare. And again, we wanted to show the transition. This isn't exactly how this will likely redevelop, but we wanted to show sort of how these sort of densities start to integrate with one another. And so you're starting to see on this plan, on the north side, maybe more of an urban edge that's consistent with the church that's going in, that was part of the PD, that requires some commercial frontage. So again, you're creating that commercial edge to create that mixed use and create that the walkability. And then you start to see more of the infill in the neighborhood on that southwest corner, maybe starting to infill with a mix of housing choices, and again, some mixed use as it matures. And then we've got a restaurant that gets introduced into the plaza there, into the existing shopping center. Next slide.
Let me point out just a couple other things. You're going to start to see that green space starts to pop up. This is where we start to take those short-term temporary activations, start to make them more permanent. So you see on the southwest corner, we put in a more permanent green space in the center of that, start to break up some of that parking field. The one I really love, though, is in that northwest corner. I think you would really start to have that town square feel that I talked about earlier if you were to put a small green space there. So this is looking southeast, so you're kind of looking at New Orleans. There's the Taco Bell right there on the left. You can see the water tower out on the horizon. So again, this is starting to help you visualize what that might look like as that neighborhood on the southwest starts to continues to build out and starts to finish up in terms of all the residential units that we're hoping to fit in there. This is taking you inside that green space on the southwest corner. We showed it as maybe having some sort of awning where you could do maybe some outdoor eating, start to activate that parking lot with some new restaurants that might be attracted to have that sort of outdoor green space eating opportunity. Go ahead. And then this is on the northwest corner. This is the one that would be nestled into the curve of that retail strip right there. Start to put in things, amenities like small tot lots or playgrounds for people to take their kids to while they're shopping.
And then ultimately, this starts to show, the build out, after 8 or 10 years. Again, showing the timeline. These interventions and some of these changes take time to evolve through some of the legacy ownership. This is going to require recruitment of maybe new retail. Working with different home builders and developers that would be interested in developing multiple projects, and again creating infrastructure and creating opportunity to bring infrastructure into some of the vacant tracts where that infrastructure doesn't exist. And so we wanted to give sort of an impression that these things take some time, but you can see we started breaking up some of the shopping centers and creating little paseos so that there's more connectivity back into the schools, and creating trails and connectivity that can ultimately connect to your regional trail system that's currently getting improved. Again, showing the mix of housing, showing the streetscapes that get improved, and increased open space and green space. Again, trying to reflect a lot of the vision and input that we heard through the public process into the vision, and translate that in a way that really where you can see your fingerprints and your vision ultimately evolve into the final master plan.
It's a little hard to see at this scale, but to Jason's point about starting to break up those long retail buildings, on the southwest corner, right where the water tower is, you notice there's an entirely new intersection that's going to start connecting back to those neighborhoods to the southwest, but also showing on the southeast corner at this point, maybe it starts to make sense to break that up, and we add a third green space there on the southeast corner, and that really starts to point towards the Freshman Academy. The last thing I'll point out is the northeast corner. Whenever we do this sort of design exercise, trying to capture people's imagination, we want to think about those opportunities where somebody might just take everything down to the ground and start entirely new, because those are also opportunities. And that we use that northeast corner as maybe the site that somebody might want to do that and come back in with a truly mixed-use development, maybe have some sort of office with retail on the first floor that would really take advantage of shared parking in that northeast corner. So I'm going to show you some photos of what that might look like. So that's what we're proposing for the northeast corner. Again, this is just an illustration. It isn't necessarily what we're recommending in terms of what it should actually look like in the end. A lot of that will take place when the private developer shows up. But start to get a sense of what it could look like sitting next to New Orleans there. Go ahead to the next one. So I showed you this one before, but I cropped out the building. This is a better vision of what the intersection might look like. You've got the shared branding on the southwest corner. You've got this entirely new development on the northeast corner. You've got your streetscape improvements in the middle there. And this last image just takes you on the ground and what it would look like in maybe 10 years' time.
So this is, again, the final master plan. Again, this may be 10 or 15, possibly up to 20 years out. So again, this takes some time, but this illustrative sort of takes the future land use and integrates the ideas and applies those into a concept plan that can again be used for future decision making, potential zoning changes, and then examples of just different interventions that could be done throughout the district. So, next slide. And so I think the key is we want to leave you with this sort of thought. It's easy to come up with new ideas. The hard part is letting go of what worked in the past and to create and integrate new ideas into a progressive vision. And it's your vision. Essentially, this is what we translated into what we've heard over the last 12 months or so through this process. And so through that, I want to thank you for your input. This is an amazing turnout. And again, I want to reiterate, if you don't have a card, we've got plenty here I know there's a lot of ideas that have been thrown at you tonight, but we want to make sure that we hear things that you like. Maybe we missed a big idea through this process that you just thought of, and so we want you to either write it down, or we're going to go out and sort of man some of the stations and be more than happy to dialogue in these things in deeper detail. Most of the key concepts that we talked about tonight are on the boards, and so one of us can kind of explain those, and you can look at them in more detail so you don't have to squint. I will provide a copy of the draft report. I know it's something that you guys are interested in. It is not final yet. I do want to reiterate that, which is good news. If we get a lot of comments and feedback tonight, then we're going to take an opportunity to maybe address that, and we'll make sure that any of the comments we hear or the notes that we get tonight will be integrated into the plan going forward. But we certainly want to continue to hear from you tonight, and if you see some things that you really love, we want that feedback. If you have some questions or concerns about how things will get implemented, how does this really happen, we're happy to explain those things to you. And again, if we miss something completely obvious to you, please let us know. Send a note through Facebook, or I'll make sure that we provide extra card and comments for you. And thank you very much for the opportunity.
Folks, I just want to finish up by saying that we hope that everyone will take the time to fill out a card and let us know what you liked, what suggestions you might have. You have all of your city council members here, all your elected officials. You have members of staff. We definitely want to hear what you have to say and what your thoughts are. This is a process. Give you a couple of examples is that the city council first started talking about the Bass Pro project in the early part of 2003, and it was approved. The document creating the Bass Pro was in 2004, and construction started in 2005. It takes time. It actually absolutely takes time in the amount of investment that has to be made. The city invested $20 to $30 million over that period of time to create the infrastructure. The Rose District is a 10 to 12 year vision of success, and it just takes time. And I can assure you that when you talk to the city council members, they are committed to trying to come up with a workable plan that they can begin the process of coming up with ways to earmark public dollars to be able to make the improvements that are necessary to be able to match the private dollars that are necessary to make this happen. And I think that it's important that you engage with the council members. Obviously, there are many things that have happened in the last couple of years that are a concern to everyone in here. I think that's why everyone is here, because I think we all have the same vision, is that we want to see this area revitalized. And so I would encourage you to engage with the council members for the next 30 minutes to an hour, fill out the cards, and then we will keep the community informed when the council is going to discuss this. I'm about 99% sure it will be on August 6th. And we will actually go through this in a limited way, with the goal of getting to start having the meetings of the advisory committee on how we can work towards implementation. And if anyone is interested in participating in that process, this is when you need to let the council members know, because every time we put a group of folks together and we start coming up with advice from the community, we've seen success. And so my recommendation to council is to engage the public in this process, because then there's a vested interest. And so please stick around and let's hear what you have to say, and then we will keep you posted as we go forward. So our thanks everyone for coming out this evening.
Thank you.